We'll be talking about the age of absolutism. I want to give you some specifics so you can understand what that means. Absolutism is the principle or the exercise of complete and unrestricted power in government. The monarchs hold executive, legislative, and judicial powers. They also believe in the divine right rule because they believe they receive their power from God and nobody could challenge them. So we're going to go and specifically talk about Europe and what's going on there. You saw in the video a very similar coat of royal arms that Elizabeth had put up really in all the churches. In Europe, absolutism dominated the political and social world of the continent from the 1500s until the Age of Revolution began in the 18th century. Critical monarchs of the time, such as Louis XIV, James I, Charles V, and Philip II, added significantly to their territories. They centralized their governments, and they constructed buildings and cities that stand to this day. Some of these monarchs you will be doing some research on and making a project and a presentation. Now we're going to look at the map of Europe. You guys will be doing a mapping activity, and it'll be one of many things you'll be doing in class tomorrow. But let's look first at the country of Spain and look at Philip II, and there you can see when he reigned. And he was a really important monarch who controlled Spain at the very height of its power. Spain had become fabulously wealthy during the Age of Exploration from the steady stream of gold and silver coming from the Americas. Like most people in Spain, Philip was also a devout Catholic, and he was intensely opposed to the Protestant Reformation. I know you remember what that is. There we go. There's Martin Luther. So, when Dutch Protestants revolted against the church in Spain, Philip sent an army that started what we call the Court of Blood. It is the torture and execution of thousands of suspected Protestant rebels. Here's specifically how Philip and many other monarchs of his time would torture people. One is the rack. Victims would be stretched until their ligaments, cartilage, and bones would actually snap. Now, hopefully you would tell them what they wanted to hear when you were being interrogated and tortured before the rack completely, hurt you. Also, they had what's called the head crusher. Here is an example of it. The victim's head would slowly be crushed, killing the victim, but again, your jaw would be crushed, your eyes would pop out of your socket. And another deadly instrument used in torture is the Spanish tickler, and basically this really wouldn't tickle you, it would tear your flesh, causing severe pain, and then obviously later infections that would cause death. Here's a picture kind of illustrating how the Spanish tickler was used. Most torture victims would eventually confess to being heretics to escape further punishment, but if they really wanted to get out of it, they would give somebody else up or tell them who they're another well-known Protestant heretic, and maybe they would get out of it. But most of them, however, would be burned alive at the stake. And what really made King Philip mad was his rival, the English Queen Elizabeth, and she was sending aids to the Dutch rebels that were causing trouble in his empire, and she would also allow her ship captains, or pirates, they were really pirates, and one well-known one was Sir Francis Drake, and they would be called sea dogs, and they would go and attack these Spanish ships coming back from the Atlantic world with all of these treasures, and he would take it. And instead of reprimanding Sir Francis Drake, Elizabeth actually made him into a knight, which further made Philip mad. And so he's going to try to stop England, and he will try to invade them. And again, this is where the Protestant and Catholic issue comes into play, because Elizabeth is an enemy because she declares herself to be head of the English Church, and she does not recognize the authority of the Pope in Rome, but Philip did say that the Pope was the head of the church. Using that gold and silver from the New World, it did also inflate his economy. He constructed an immense fleet. They call it the Spanish Armada. It was this amazing fleet of ships, and he was going to go to England to teach Elizabeth a lesson. So this happens in 1588. And here's just a painting of that. But on their way, it really is the weather that does it for the Spanish Armada. They damaged it, and his smaller, faster boats were better for battle, and he had to use his heavier boats. And the English had lighter ships. And then the English set 8 ships on fire and aimed them at the remaining Armada ships. And in a panic, they fled from the fire ships, and it is going to be a huge victory for Elizabeth. Because, again, the Spanish were considered the most powerful country in the world at this time. And they went really they were broke, they were dealing with constant warfare, they were fighting the Ottoman Turks, they were fighting in the Netherlands, and you will see Spain will decline as a major world power, and it kind of starts with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Now we're moving on to France. What a great looking guy there. Is King Louis the 14th of France. And he's also known as the Sun King, and we're going to talk more about him in just a little bit. The Protestant Reformation, as you guys know, you consider that around Germany with the help of the printing press. It soon will spread to France and will cause just as much conflict and devastation. The French monarchy was Catholic, and they really had a growing minority, and they said 1 in 10 Frenchmen were Huguenots, or French Protestants. And you will see this fighting will really turn deadly. And if you know French, say that line there for me. But it means 1 king, 1 law, 1 religion, or if you are in a French language class, you could say that. Just like the Spanish, the Frenchmen really reacted with violence and discrimination. And again, try to ask yourself, what is the real difference between a Protestant and a Catholic in this time period? And you will see fighting will break out really all over France between the Catholics and the Huguenots. And the violence came to a boiling point. You can see here the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It's estimated between 10,000 and 70,000 Huguenots are going to be killed in the streets of Paris. You will hear more about that in the presentation that we get. And if you know what that means, these symbols, there you go, you would figure that equation out right there. And again, this is just a painting of all the fighting that happens. And here's the queen that is supposedly kind of watching all these things that are going on. Hopefully you notice who that lady was right there. It was no longer safe to be a Huguenot in France, and many began to leave or convert back to Catholicism. And a famous convert, Henry of Navarre, which he will, another nice looking guy there, he will deny his religion, and he will gain strong alliances and eventually become Henry IV, the next king of France. Very famous quote from him is, "Paris is well worth a mass." You will be hearing more about him. Henry IV knew that in order to gain control of France, he needed to restore peace, and he will issue the Edict of Nantes. There we go, we have peace now. It guaranteed the Huguenots certain freedoms, like freedom to worship, right to hold office, and the protection from the Inquisition. Again, during the Inquisition, it's very famous in Spain, but literally Protestants, Muslims, Jews, anyone that was not a part in supporting the Catholic Church will be killed, and again, tortured, persecuted. And this was Henry IV's most successful achievement, in that he will create peace, eliminate debt, create new industries, and create a trade. He became one of France's most respected monarchs. Unfortunately for Henry, he was assassinated 10 years later by a Catholic who hated the Edict of Nantes and how it protected the Huguenots, and his carriage was stopped in traffic, and he was stabbed to death. And here's a painting of that engraving. This allowed Henry's grandson, Louis XIV, to rise and become history's best example of an absolute monarch. I said I was getting back to the Sun King. Here it is. He reigned in France for 72 years and 110 days, making it one of the longest in European history. He had absolute power, and he had extreme confidence, and he chose the sun to kind of show that, hey, everything revolved around him. And really, Louis learned, he became king when he was actually 5, so that's kind of why he's so old. Longest reign, 72 years, but he's going to kind of take away the nobles' influence and power, and he's going to create this immense, amazing Palace of Versailles. I did travel to Versailles, and I will soon be showing you pictures. Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, and that was his idea. He wanted to be right with all of those noblemen, and all of these noblemen would then come to the Palace of Versailles, and he would, again, keep them away from Paris, which seemed to be a hotbed of trouble. He also forced the nobles to spend their money through clothing, fine dining, and gambling, which kept them poor. So they will not be able to invest their money in armies to overthrow him. It wasn't a bad idea. It was a mini city. Versailles is absolutely beautiful. We'll look at some pictures here very soon. It could hold 20,000 officials, servants, and nobles. It took 36,000 workers and 6,000 horses 50 years to build it. And this is obviously a painting of the Palace of Versailles. Here's how it looks on the outside. Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. And again, so all the noblemen are staying away from Paris. This is the very famous Hall of Mirrors, where the treaty from World War I will be signed, among many other wars, and you can see the paintings on the ceiling. But what a great idea. He showed his absolutist side by completely defeating the Huguenots once and for all. He revoked the Edict of Nantes, and again, you will see over 200,000 Huguenots will flee France. Moving on briefly just to talk about the most interesting monarch, Henry VIII. There he is. A lot of this should be a review for you. Henry was, again, part of the old and powerful Tudor royal family. So it was very shaky bloodline, but Henry had to provide heirs. So this should all be an absolute review for you. But just to know, again, how Henry ruled and how he was really an absolute monarch. Unfortunately, for most of history, males were considered the superior sex in almost every aspect of life. Ooh, that meat's disgusting. By acknowledging his own mortality, Henry needed a male heir. So we see Catherine of Aragon, they only had one child. This is Queen Mary, also known as Bloody Mary. Again, she married Philip II, but she died. And just to kind of make a connection to Elizabeth, Elizabeth, again, did not want to marry her sister's husband after she died, Philip II. Henry was terrified, so poor Catherine, after 24 years, she's gone. Again, you wouldn't have to write this down. This is really just a review for you. He married Anne Boleyn. There she is, and her daughter was Elizabeth, and so her head is chopped off. Jane Seymour, she, pooped out a male heir named Edward. And then Jane dies during childbirth, and little Eddie too, when he was just 16 years old. Again, that guy's immortal though, right? Anne, she was 49 years older than her, or Henry was 49 years older than her, and he was disappointed, if you remember, says, I don't like the way she looks. They got a divorce, then he married Catherine Howard, but only 3 weeks after divorcing Anne. Nice guy, Henry. The king was literally 50 years old, and he was 300 pounds. Not very attractive to Catherine, and she cheats on him, and we know what happens to her. And then Catherine Parr, Henry was so old, she really was just like a nurse to him. Catherine outlived the crazy old Henry. And again, Henry was an absolute monarch that did really whatever he wanted. And you see that his daughter, again, he's most famous monarch, but also his daughter Elizabeth is going to reign supreme. And her greatest accomplishment was really defeating the Spanish Armada and being able to refuse an heir and not to get married because she knew that would give up her power. Now you will proceed to take the 2-question quiz. Be sure that you've taken notes on this and you understand it. You will be doing a very quick, again, 40-minute activity tomorrow on applying these principles of the age of absolutism.